You know, I suppose the more I think about it, the more I'm okay. I admit I'm a rogue, but it was the wizard's fault for paying us in advance, right?
Like I said, he shouldn't have given us the money in advance if he wanted to make sure it got there. It's his fault. We just burn the books and no one knows any wiser, right? It's just a pile of books. I'm free!
Today's video contains 2 tutorials. If you're just interested in seeing how we paint the miniature, skip forward to about 10 minutes and 50 seconds, and that should begin where we start painting things. Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite creatures in D&D, and that is the Mimic. And Mimics can be scaled to all kinds of levels. Mimics never really get old as long as you're not going over the top with them. Now I have found a bunch of 3D printer models so that you could basically make an entire room full of Mimics, which I plan to kind of do at some point. But this is the first video in what I hope is going to be a long line of Mimics. And I decided to not go with a traditional Mimic of a treasure chest Mimic, and we're going to be doing a Mimic that is disguised as a pile of books, or perhaps several Mimics disguised as a pile of books. And I just love the idea of a Mimic being disguised as a book, because your players could loot a room, find what appears to be a magically enchanted book, they flip it open, and then suddenly it latches onto their face like a face hugger. I think that is just an absolutely wonderful image to put in someone's head, and I hope that you guys think that this is really cool. Today's video is basically going to be how to paint very simplistically and easily using washes and glazes and things like that, and we're going to be using Citadel contrast paints, which are essentially like painting with ink. So if you've ever worked with ink before, you could do that. If you've never worked with ink before, start with Citadel contrast paints. They can be a little bit expensive, but as you'll see, the pigmentation and how easy they are to use is just phenomenal. So without further ado, let's get on with the tutorial. Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're basically going to be trying out a new camera angle where I have it basically directly where I am seeing it. I am looking right over the top of the camera. Hopefully this creates a better viewing image for you guys, and it also means that I can pull the wet palette into frame when we use it so that you can get a better idea of how I'm mixing my paints to end up with the colors that I am using and how I'm thinning them out. But without further ado, let's go ahead and move on with today's tutorial. First and foremost, you want to start with a thin sheet of foam. As you can see, mine's quite thin, and even on that one side it's a little too thin because you can see the plastic underneath, but that's okay. You just want to cut out a nice thin sheet of foam. The best thing I can tell you is to cut out a square a little bit larger than the base, glue it on, and then cut away the excess. Then you want to get yourself like a popsicle stick or something similar to what I'm doing to act as a brace for scoring this. We're basically going to be cutting lines into this to simulate planks of wood, and you can then slide it along to do planks of the size that you want, or to skew them a little bit, either left or right, and use the whole width of the popsicle stick like I'm going to be doing to measure out whole planks. Now the reason you may want to skew it a little bit left to right or to make some different sizes would be to simulate different types of wood in an environment, meaning if you wanted this to look like an old dockyard, you would want bigger gaps in between your planks, or if you wanted this to look like an abandoned house, you may want the planks to look a little wonky and not be necessarily so uniform. In my case, I imagine this Mimic's going to get used a lot in libraries, so I want my planks to be as uniform as possible. So next you want to come in with your X-Acto knife and you're going to cut a bit of a V along the same shape as your planks. And the reason you want to do that is because we want to make that gap a little bit more noticeable so that when we put washes on them or panel lines, we can basically deepen that gouge and it will show up really, really well. Now because I ended up using such a thin piece of foam, I wasn't really happy with how deep my grooves were, and I ended up using a bit of a handsaw just to kind of deepen things a little bit. If you'd used a thicker piece of foam than what I did, it would work out just fine. As you can see, it looks okay, but once we start to put texture on, all that kind of stuff goes away, so I reinforce those lines by just cutting into the base a little bit. Next, you're going to want to get yourself some kind of wire brush. If your family does some barbecuing, you probably already have one for cleaning the grill. If not, you can get one just like the one you see on screen. Super cheap. Sometimes you can get them in a 3-pack for like a couple of bucks. Amazon sells these things for crazy cheap. It's not hard to find. This is going to be used for simulating wood grain texture, so you want to kind of push in and start to drag. Now as soon as it begins to tear the foam, as you can see, you want to stop. The more you start to do this after the foam tears, the worse those tears are going to get. Then flip the base around and do it from the opposite side. This is to make sure that your wood grain goes all the way across from one side to the other instead of just being from one direction, in which case you can end up with your grain not going all the way through the planks on both sides. Then we want to check where we're going to be mounting our piece here. In the case of the Mimic, because I know it's resin versus the foam, I know that the glue won't be the strongest bond in the world, so we're actually going to pin this miniature, and I'm going to show you exactly how I do that. Now, whether you're using a piece of wire or a paper clip, you're going to need some kind of clippers. Now, a lot of people tend to use their good clippers. As you can see, what happens with your good clippers is you'll end up gouging the cutting edge of your clippers by clipping through metal with them. A lot of times these hobby clippers are made of aluminum, and the steel that is used for making paper clips will actually ruin your clippers. So if you've got an old ruined pair of clippers, then go ahead and use those for doing things like this. But if you want to save your clippers, there's a really simple way to make sure that you're going to not ruin them the way that I have ruined mine. Something to keep in mind that the front leading edge of your clippers is typically what we cut the models with, so you want to stay away from that. As you can see, you want to put that metal rod as far back into the jaws as possible. This is going to reduce the chance of you messing up the cutting edge of your clippers. And then we want to reach around with an extra couple of fingers and hold on as best as we can. This is going to stop you from just shooting pieces off across the room. Trust me, there's plenty of times where I've launched a small metal rod across the room when just trying to clip something out like this, and you'll find it a week or two later the fun way with your feet. Now, if you're really hesitant to use your clippers and you really don't want to do them, there's actually something that you can do here, and that's basically you fold it as tightly as you can. You're going to basically pinch into a 90-degree angle to make sure that you're not using too much wire, and then you're going to continue to fold it past until it creates a loop. And basically, once you create that loop, you're going to make it as small and as tight as possible, and then you're going to reverse it in the other direction and do the same thing. What you're doing is you're basically weakening the metal, and you're just going to keep wiggling it back and forth like that until it eventually snaps. Now, this can take a really long time if you're using tough metal, and I really don't recommend doing it this way, as you end up with really sharp edges that you can cut yourself on. Next, we need to drill a hole in our piece, but we need to make sure that the drill bit doesn't skip around. The last thing we want is for ourselves to, accidentally hurt ourselves by stabbing ourselves in the hand. So we're basically going to create this X shape. That X is going to act like a small pilot hole right in the center for our razor blade. We then just want to spin it around a little bit. You're not pushing the razor blade into the piece, you're just simply spinning it around, and that's going to create a big enough pilot hole for our pin vise or our hand drill, or however you want to phrase it. These things are really cheap on Amazon. You don't have to buy a branded one like what I have. I actually was given mine as a gift, and then you just want to drill out the hole. Now, it's important to keep in mind the angle of which you're drilling out. If it's a really thin piece and you want to make sure that as much of it is protected as possible, you want to drill at the same angle as the piece. Now, that is to say, in the case here, you can see that there is plenty of resin for me to drill into to make sure that a good 1/4 of an inch worth of this metal rod ends up in there. But if I really wanted to be sure of it, as you could see there, we would drill up at an angle to make sure that as much of this rod ends up in there as possible. But this really isn't necessary for something like this, so we're just going to drill about a 1/4 of an inch of the way into our piece and then glue that into place. Now let's take a quick second to talk about glue. We want to make sure that the glue isn't going to run all over the place, so we want to use a gel type glue. We also want to make sure that the glue we're using isn't going to eat into the foam, which is why you can see a lot of times in my videos I use Loctite brand glue. I know that it is a bit of an acetone based glue, but I know that the acetone is not over the top, so I know I don't have to be fearful of it eating the foam. Next, we want to gauge about where the middle is. Since we basically pinned the miniature right in the middle, we know that we need to pin the base right in the middle as well. Now, this is really lucky with us using a foam top to our base, because we can just press the pin in and figure out about where we want it to end up anyway. If you're trying to pin a metal model or a metal base, you'll end up needing to measure things out and do a similar pilot hole to what we talked about with the razor blade on the bottom of the resin miniature anyway. Now, it is important to always protect your foam, especially if you plan to use spray paints for when you go to do your zenithal highlights later or when you go to do your priming. So Jeremy from Black Magic Craft has a really wonderful recipe for how to do that using Mod Podge, and I'll put a link to that here. But we're just going to take a liberal coating of super glue, and as you'll see, I'm actually kind of globbing it on. Now we don't need to go right up to the edges of the miniature, but we need to get a liberal enough coating on there that it's not going to come off later or come off while we're pinning this in place. Once you have that in place, we're going to need to cut off the excess. Now in my personal opinion, you should always cut it off about double the length of the base. Now if your base ends up being solid, then just cut it off flush and don't worry about these next few steps. Depending on the material used to make your pin, it may be difficult for you to fold it over, so just take the V in your clippers and rest that against there and use it as a fulcrum to help get you started, and then push it as flat as you can. Then apply a liberal coat of super glue across everything that metal is touching to make sure that it gets locked down good and tight. This is going to ensure that if anything fails, it'll be the other side of the base where your mini is and not the bottom of the base. The last thing you want is for this pin to just kind of strip out and fall out, because then you'll be constantly re-gluing things in place, and that's just not good. So I've cut out the part where we did some zenithal highlighting to get everything started, but if you don't know what a zenithal highlight is, consider the top of this bottle to be the miniature and our paintbrush here to be our bottle of spray paint. So essentially what we're doing is we're spraying the entire thing with either black or gray, and then we're spraying directly from the top, and we're using either white or gray accordingly. If your base is black, you could use gray or white. If your base is gray, you want to strictly use white. And what this is going to do as we spray around from about a 45-degree angle is it's going to show us where all the highlights would be, so that no matter where you want your light source to be around the miniature, you know where to paint. Typically with panel line accent color, you want to use these in specifically just the recesses or any panel lines, exactly what it says on the tin. We're going to be mixing this today, and we're going to be using a lot of the brown across the entire top of the miniature, and then once it dries, we're going to be hitting the deepest recesses and the bottom with black, and then we're going to do some dry brushing on top of that. Now what this does is it means that a lot of the deepest recesses we don't really have to worry about once we start painting the miniature. It just allows us to do a lot of pre-shading in advance. Now if you don't have panel line, it's okay, don't worry about it. Just thin down some browns and black paints, use those as some glazes, and just lightly apply it across the entire miniature the same way you see us doing it with the panel line accent colors. I'm just using these panel line colors because they're super great for what they do. They seep into the recesses and they settle in the recesses, and they don't tend to pool too badly on any of the raised surfaces. Now if you do get some pooling like you can see on some of the book pages, that's fine. You can just wipe it away with your finger or a Q-tip. Just try and get a nice even coat of these colors across everything. Now here you can see me using a technique that I kind of like to refer to as reverse edge highlighting, and that is where we take a Q-tip with some rubbing alcohol and just kind of rub away and reveal that previous layer. Now in my opinion, you can be a bit too aggressive with this when doing this. This is a technique that takes a lot of skill and time to master, and as you can very definitely tell by what I'm doing, I don't quite know how to do this skill yet. I'm willing to admit that. Simply skip over this step. I wanted to show it because I wanted to show how and why I ended up where I ended up, but you can just use dry brushes of grays and whites and pretty much get the exact same effect. Now just like I said at the start of this video, we're going to be using contrast paints. Now if you don't have contrast paints, you can do 2 or 3 colors with Citadel washes or whatever brand of washes you happen to have. If you don't want to use washes, you can just use regular acrylic paint. Just be aware that you'll need to thin down your paints a little bit and do some edge highlighting. But the reason we're using contrast paints is so that we don't have to edge highlight all these books. I don't know about you, but going in and edge highlighting them, although it would look really good, would just drive me mad and would take way too much time than what I think it would be worth in the long run. Considering the fact that this is a monster that'll probably get removed from the table within a few minutes of it going on, I'm not really worried about the loss of detail. Now if you don't want to invest in the entire line of the Citadel contrast, you can just get the contrast medium. Like you can see here, if I were to take some of the Macragge blue and mix it in with a contrast medium, I would end up with a contrast Macragge blue. As long as it seems to be acrylic paint, I haven't had any issues so far with mixing contrast mediums and other brands of acrylic paint. It seems to work just fine as long as you're not using super cheap paints like apple barrel paints. Although I know several of you guys use apple barrel paints for painting your miniatures, I do suggest not using them with the contrast medium. So moving right along with the tutorial, we want to just pick out some of the books and just coat them in whatever colors that you want. Try to keep in mind that you only want to keep about 2 to 3 books in a row the same color. Now as you can see here on screen, I'm actually having an issue with the contrast paints not wanting to stick to the miniature, and that's because the panel line doesn't seem to want to stick. It's being very hydrophobic. And there's an easy way to fix this, but in the event that you ever get paint in a place that you don't want it, simply wet your brush and flood the miniature. This can act like an eraser and allow you to scrub back the layer you just put on. But like I said, a really good way to fix this was to put some Tester's dull coat across the entire model, and then as you'll see going forward, I never really have that problem again. Now when it comes to the inside of their mouths or any of the fleshy bits, I would recommend using a pinkish color. In this case, this is Breast Cancer Awareness Pink, also known as Monster Maw, and Demon Height Flesh, which is a more purplish tone. If you're going to have multiple of them on the base at a time, I recommend using 2 different colors. In this case, like with the purple book, I'm going with the pink, and with other colored books, I'm going with the purple. And what this is going to do is that bright pink is going to bring your eyes to the front of the miniature, the face of the miniature, that lead book at the top that I keep bumping with the brush. Making sure to paint the roof of the mouth and any of the exposed gums that they may have. As you can see, I end up just painting along the outermost edge along the bottom jaw and a little bit on the front top jaw. Off camera, I went ahead and took care of all the little accoutrements on the books. That's all those little extra corners and edges, and the bindings on the back. I just hit them with some silvers and golds. Basically, if it was a cool color, I tried to use warm golds because it would make it pop, and if it's warm colors, I used cool silvers because, again, it helps things to pop a bit more. Next, we want to highlight those teeth, and we don't have to completely cover up everything because a little bit of that brown showing through will make the teeth look a bit more natural. So we want to pick an off-white. In my case, I chose Wraithbone, but you may decide to use a different color, or you may want them to be bright pearly white. It doesn't really matter as long as we get a highlight on there. Try to keep it out of the recesses again, because then it goes against all that pre-shading that we did at the beginning of the video. Use that same off-white to kind of dry brush the pages up a little bit. This is going to make them seem a little bit mottled and make them look more like parchment instead of them just being all one solid color. Do your best to stay out of the direct binding of the books, as we want to have that as a nice deep shadow. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and if you've seen my beholder video, you'll know that I can do eyeballs okay. Now we're gonna kind of cheat, and we're gonna do these similar to gemstones, as these are magical creatures, and I don't necessarily know if all magical creatures would have normal eyes. So we want to start out with a dark green, in my case warpstone glow, and we're just gonna paint the entirety of the eyeball with that warpstone glow, and then we're gonna come in with a bit of moot green, and in a bit of a crescent shape add in all of our highlights. Now here's a tool that I highly recommend that you invest in. Prismacolor makes one of these markers with this super fine tip pen, and you can get them in all kinds of different colors, including a very deep black, a deeper one than what you see me using. It makes it really easy to put these squiggly lines on, especially for people like me who have a bit of a shakier hand than normal. Basically, I choose to use this instead of using a paintbrush because I tend to make a bit of a mistake or a bit of a mess when I use a paintbrush. With this marker, it's just so easy to hold and it's so easy to use. There's no reason why I shouldn't invest in something like this, and there's no reason why you shouldn't invest in it either. One final step to finish things off, for me at least, was I wanted to go ahead and reinforce those lines where the individual planks were, so I ended up going back in with the panel accent color black and using that to just kind of block everything in and really make those planks more distinct. And there you have it, guys, this super simple, super easy to do mimic. I ended up using a bit of Nurgle's Rot in the mouth of the mimic because I just wanted to bring some more color and texture to it, but you could really leave that out and just leave it the bright pink. I think the greenish yellow kind of works. I don't know, let me know in the comments below, tell me what you guys think. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed this tutorial and you can apply it to other things. If you're interested in finding this 3D print, I'll do my best to find the exact one and post it in the comments below. If you've got any ideas or any suggestions for future videos, please feel free to leave those in the comments as well. Who knows, you may inspire the next episode. Thank you guys so much for all the love and support that you have shown this channel and my other social medias. If you would like to sponsor an episode but you don't really know how, you can purchase an item from my Amazon wish list, and what that does is it not only gets you a free shout out in the video where it is used, but we try and make sure that it is the next one that comes out. As soon as the object arrives, we put everything on hold and we use that item to do a tutorial or make it the sole purpose of the video, and that will be the next one that comes out. But until next time, guys, thank you guys so much for all the love and support, and as always, I hope that your display case is always full and your pile of shame never runs empty. Until next time, guys.